This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. On our 700th show.
Wow.
This is your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, is Adam Gardner.
What's up, 700 boys?
All of you 700 out there listening. We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to explore whether false beliefs are becoming more common.
Yeah, that's right.
But first, I will discuss the rise of podcasts.
Ooh.
Because it sounds like Rise of the Beast, Adam is more intrigued, but it will not be about Transformers.
No.
If you're listening to this, you may have heard of podcasts. Given that it is our 700th episode, I want to do a segment that seemed a bit more fitting. Not just some empty navel gazing, but some deep navel gazing. Way back in 2008, before some of you might have been born, this podcast began. Largely inspired by The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, John found Pat and Adam and Xander and some others, and then Xander found me. If you're listening to this, as I said, you listen to podcasts, and so do I, and so do many others. It now seems that almost everyone has a podcast. But let me tell you, youngins, back 16 years ago, many people didn't know what a podcast was, let alone regular listeners. So yes, I'm saying we did it before it was cool.
Is it cool now?
No. I didn't say it was cool, just before it was cool.
Okay, got it.
Today's segment will provide an overview of podcasts and podcasting and how things have changed a bit over time. Let's start with a quick and incomplete history of podcasting. Going back to the last century, podcasts didn't exist for most of it. This is largely for technological reasons. How to get a recording of some material to people so they can listen to it whenever they want. There was some distribution of material on tapes in the 1980s, but it was really the advent of the internet in the 1990s that allowed people to download radio shows and other programs. Quoting Wikipedia, in September 2000, the first system that enabled the selection, automatic downloading, and storage of serial episodic audio content on PCs and portable devices was launched from early MP3 player manufacturer i2Go. To supply content for its portable MP3 players, i2Go introduced a digital audio news and entertainment service called myaudio2go.com that enabled users to download episodic news, sports, entertainment, weather, and music in audio format for listening on a PC, the Ego portable audio player, and other MP3 players.
So they produced that content. This wasn't like user-created content.
Not at that point. No, not from them. They had a media manager thing and a file transfer application that could be programmed to automatically download the latest episodic content available from user-selected content types to a PC or portable device as desired. The service lasted over a year, but succumbed when the i2Go company ran out of capital during the dot-com crash and folded.
Rough time.
But of course, progress did not stop there. In the early 2000s, software engineer Dave Weiner was trying to figure out how to utilize RSS, and in 2003 developed an audio RSS feed for former New York Times reporter Christopher Linden. Linden used this feed to offer audio content of notable interviews on his blog. The automatic downloading of new episodes is a key part of the definition of a podcast to many people, and RSS allowed that to happen. And that brings us to the iPod. In 2004, Dave Weiner teamed up with former MTV VJ, those are also foreign words and letters from other people, Adam Curry, to create iPodder, a program that allowed people to download internet radio broadcasts and other audio content to their iPods. These broadcasts were soon called podcasts, a portmanteau of iPod and broadcast, coined by journalist Ben Hammersley.
Cool.
The iPod is so integral to the world of podcasting that that's where the pod comes from. Not Wales. Additionally, it was in 2003 that the first podcast hosting platform, Libsyn, or Liberated Syndication, was launched. This platform allowed podcasters to upload and distribute their shows. But it was in 2005 that things really picked up when Apple added podcasting to its iTunes 4.9 music software and building a directory of podcasts at its iTunes music store. The new iTunes could subscribe to, download, and organize podcasts, which made a separate aggregator application unnecessary for many users. This move significantly boosted podcasting's popularity and accessibility.
Game changer.
2005 is also when the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe began.
Oh, wow. They were right on there.
Yeah, I didn't realize how early they were. 2006 saw the term podcasting named the word of the year by the New Oxford American Dictionary, highlighting its growing influence. Following chronologically, in the mid to late 2000s, the success of Ricky Gervais' television show on BBC then inspired them to do a podcast. The first series of this, Ricky Gervais Show podcast, was the world's most successful podcast for several years, eventually gaining more than 300 million unique downloads by March 2011.
One of the first podcasts I listened to. Is
I did not, so
really
this
good.
surprised me. The Adam Carolla Show, with its supposed record of 60 million in 2011, was nowhere near as popular. Like, Ricky Gervais is just that popular. Wild. Now, 2006 also saw the introduction of This American Life, a very popular show, while 2009 saw popular shows from comedians like WTF with Mark Maron, and of course, The Joe Rogan Experience making their debut. You may have heard of Joe Rogan. While there were numerous new podcasts about a diverse range of topics, many credit the release of Serial in 2014 making podcasts go mainstream.
Yeah.
The podcast was a surprise success, achieving 68 million downloads by the end of season 1 and becoming the first podcast to win a Peabody Award, usually for journalism. It was a bit of a cultural phenomenon and definitely popularized true crime podcasts. I never really got into it. It's not quite my thing, but I know it's very, very popular. And a friend just listened to the 3rd season, which I think dealt with Guantanamo Bay, and they really liked it, for what that's worth. So fast forwarding a bit, what now? It seems almost every comedian has a podcast, as do many celebrities, as do most news networks. Freakonomics was and is very successful, and now there are 4 associated podcasts in their little network. Malcolm Gladwell and other authors also have podcasts. This means that we now have nearly all broadcast material available as podcasts and the creation of many new podcasts. Many think that listening to things in real time, where you can't pause it or speed it up in terms of the play rate, is much less desirable. No projection there at all. I think it's hard to get reliable stats on how things have changed over the past 16 years, but roughly, U.S. monthly podcast listeners was less than 10% in 2008, and now it's closer to 50%. We all know some people who listen to podcasts every day and often for hours. Pat on his walks. There are over 4 million podcasts in existence.
Wow.
With Apple hosting over 2 million.
Okay. Does it mean they host them or they're available through iTunes or Apple?
Like in the sense of the Apple Store. Yeah, you can find those there.
Yeah.
Hosted in that sense, accessible. But they're not literally doing it, as far as I understand. Now, many of those are not active, which the definition of that is releasing an episode in the past 90 days. But that shouldn't rule them out. Sometimes there's a great podcast series of 6 to 10 episodes that did what it set out to do, and then it's just a couple years old. Right? It just exists as like, oh, that good documentary or movie or something from a couple years ago. Hardcore history is still great, but episodes might come out only once a year, maybe. Unsurprisingly, podcasting advertising and revenue has gone up significantly, passing the $1 billion mark in 2021 and estimated to be $4 billion in 2024.
Throw $1 billion our way, guys.
You have $4 billion. You can't spare one.
Yeah, come on.
I sometimes reflect on how different things used to be. Yes, people had portable music players, and some would listen to books on tape or CDs if they were driving somewhere. But our ears were largely open. When you waited in line, you just stood there.
Yeah.
The informational and educational advantage is staggering if one finds good, reliable content. A big if, given how pervasive misinformation is and how algorithms direct people to increasingly problematic and addictive content. Just as a comparison, think of yourself listening to podcasts every day or week compared to a world where you didn't. How much more would you know? How would you see the world differently?
Yeah, obviously, like, I've learned a ton from podcasts, but also from audiobooks. I think that takes up my listening time. Maybe it's odd, but I almost never listen to music anymore. I just listen to podcasts and audiobooks. And I think it's helped me immensely.
I'm in the same boat, Adam. I think we're also not huge music people, right? We like music, but not as much as, say, Pat and Christina and other people. But that said, there's so much learning that goes on that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise without something like podcasts.
Yep.
And sometimes it's hard to realize just how much one has learned over time. Like, okay, so I listened to this show, which I thought was interesting, say like a couple hundred times over the past couple of years. And how did that affect you? You're like, I don't know, I know things. but I think it is subtle, but I think sometimes it can be very, very large. So where are things going? Well, with various new technologies, including AI, we seem to be moving to a world where more and more content is audio. Notebook LM allows people to upload a document and create a podcast based on the content. 2 AI people will discuss the material in a typical podcast format. Cool. It's very impressive. And recently, they are giving users more options, so the utility of that will only increase. Because sometimes the auto-generated thing, you're like, that's not quite what I wanted, or have more detail, or don't talk exactly like that. And what about the reality check? Well, we've changed over the years, for sure. Bit of Shipathesius thing going on. But our core theme never has. Promoting science and critical thinking and cognitive humility. We've done over 2,000 segments fighting misinformation. And clearly we've been successful because there isn't any misinformation anymore.
Misinformation completely gone from the
Just
world.
Gone. Managed to stop it. Yes. And where's the thank you? Lost in the mail, the actual literal mail. Well, it does feel like we are currently awash in misinformation, so perhaps all those shows we didn't really matter? Well, being critically minded, it is a reasonable question to ask, and we should entertain different hypotheses. Personally, I think it's the wrong counterfactual conclusion. A plausible interpretation of our impact is that things would be even worse. Or, more defensibly, we haven't been net negative.
And yeah, and I'll touch on this a bit in my next segment, but there's always this idea of like, if there's good information and bad information, do things look like they're even, but both are actually making a big difference? They're just kind of countering each other. Without the existence of the reality check, would the world be in pure chaos? Right? We don't know.
It's possible. It's entirely possible.
Personally, I think the show's had a very positive impact on my own life. And you know, I mean that personally and both like intellectually. So obviously I enjoy doing the show and I've made good friends doing the show. But it's just kind of interesting that like some topic will come up at a dinner party or something like that. And I'll just chime in and someone will say, how did you know that? Where'd you read about that? I'd be like, well, I spent 3 hours researching this topic. And then there's so many of these topics that I've spent so much time with. And that's obviously useful to me, and hopefully it's useful to our listeners as well.
Yeah, it's several hundred each in 2,000 different segments overall, something like that. And that dinner party line is something I often say is that, what's it like doing a podcast? I'm like, well, it makes you more annoying at dinner parties. Yes. And like, well, actually, how do you know that? Well, I looked into it. Now, they're going to know your audience, and I don't do that because that would be too annoying. But there is the benefit, which comes from the practice of researching something, thinking about how to think things through, the methodology, honing your own critical thinking skills, not just talking about it, but practicing it to then present it. And then, yes, you are in the real world, and people say something, and I go, I don't think that's true. So I have both things where I remember in detail why something's wrong, and then I more often have just a sense that something's not quite correct because we did a segment, and if we've done it, chances are the conclusion was the popular understanding is not correct. It's very rare like this thing was being spread around on Facebook, and it's true. I think we might have 2 of those. I think it's been great personally in the sense of truth seeking and honing my own critical thinking skills. But separate from us and our podcast, Adam, have false beliefs become more common over time?
It has been a long time since we started the show over 16 years ago.
What?
Has this and other such efforts helped? Here at The Reality Check, we strive every show to tease out what's true about various aspects of the world. My personal philosophy is that giving people the right information is the best way to counter bad information. Empirically, this may not always seem to work, but I find it morally justifiable, and I think that if you lie or deceive to encourage a true belief, there may be unintended consequences such as erosion of trust, which ultimately lead to less belief in what is true.
But also like greater social cohesion, institutional reliability, society crumbles. Not to be dramatic.
Yeah, these are all nice things to have, a functional society and things like that. So how's all this working out? Now I want to take some metrics that are kind of evidently true or false to see how people's belief in them has changed. So apologies if you don't agree with some of these, if you don't agree that the belief that I believe to be true is the correct one. I also mostly try to look at things that have been around since 2008 and are still relevant. So like COVID conspiracy theories, they're not really valuable in this kind of analysis, or beliefs that whether or not Jeffrey Epstein killed himself aren't really relevant because he was still alive in 2008.
All right, so you're saying we got to figure out how things have changed over time. We have to find some metrics or things we can actually measure and assess. So we're going to look at different beliefs related to science, critical thinking, skepticism, which then people might perceive as more or less true over time.
That's right.
All right.
I want to see how the internet, how the landscape's changed this.
Let's go for it.
First up would be evolution, or rather belief in evolution versus belief in intelligent design. And the other one would be that God just created humans as they are. A graph of American beliefs about human origins from 1982 to 2024 asks which of the following 3 statements people believe most. 1. Human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided this process. So that's kind of intelligent design.
All right, that's a contender. I'm holding on to that one as a maybe.
I think some people believe that.
Oh, I'll see what the other 2 are, but this is a strong start.
Sure. So this belief has barely changed over the past 40 years. So from 2008 to today, it hasn't changed much either. So basically it was 36% in 2008, 34% today. It goes up and down, but basically it's always between 30 and 40%. So I think that's ballpark. Close enough. Number 2, human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God had no part in this process.
Oh, I like that one better. I'm going to change my answer.
I do like that one better, yeah. Encouragingly, this one is going up. So it was 9% in 1982, gradually going up to 24% in 2024. In 2008, it was 14%. So somewhat steady increase over time. We can't say the internet is what changed people's mind because, there's a big gap from 82 to 2008. But yeah, it's slowly going up.
So about a quarter.
Mm-hmm. Finally, number 3, God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years or so.
So that's tempting, but I'm going to stick with 2.
Yeah, I think this one was plausible, 1,000 years ago.
This is creationism. Yeah.
So this is the least scientifically plausible perspective in my mind. This belief has gone down mostly lately. So it was 44% in 1984. It was also 44% in 2008. Hadn't changed much.
Uh-huh.
It's because we hadn't started.
That's true.
The show.
That's true. It's the only way. It's the only reason.
Hitting the pavement, changing minds. It is down to 37% in 2024. That's not huge. This has been and remains the most popular answer.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So though the percentages have changed, and the least scientific one went down, and the most scientific one went up, they are ranked in popularity from the least scientific to the most scientific, which is kind of terrible. So
progress, though.
Yeah.
Progress.
Better. Doesn't mean it's good, but it's better. How about the moon landing? I found it hard to find specific numbers over time. One source said that around 5% of people don't believe that humans landed on the moon consistently over time, which frankly is a very small number. That's tiny.
Yeah, that's like the lizard people number.
Yeah. You can usually find percentages like that will believe almost anything. A 2019 article cited that number currently, so that being 5 years ago, at around 10%, while it was closer to 6% in 1999. So this suggests that this false belief is increasing, but it's hard to see specifically when that false belief became more prominent. I found similar numbers in another article saying that the belief had changed from 6% to 10% between 1995 and 2021. So this is certainly a case where more information is likely causing more confusion, since it was probably harder to find moon landing conspiracy theory content before the proliferation of the internet and streaming video sites. So sure, there was the odd documentary about it on TV, but I think this kind of thing is sort of an extremely online belief.
Yeah, getting a newsletter in the mail is not quite the same as the interaction that social media allows.
Yeah, did someone go to the library and check out a book that specifically talked about this? That's not going to be a huge amount of people. Specifically with podcasts, we have investigative journalist Bar Sibrel, who was on the Joe Rogan podcast earlier this year to share his evidence that the moon landing was fake. So much to say, I think this false belief has increased slightly over time.
I'll just say that for Joe. I mean, I know he's having conversations, but...
He was not... he's always a little open-minded and respectful of his guests, but he didn't seem to be convinced of this idea. We'll say that for him. General public interest in science hasn't changed drastically over the past 16 years. So comparing surveys on interest in various science-related issues from 1981 to 2016, so it's still quite a while back, shows changes over time for many metrics, but less change recently. For example, interest in new medical discoveries went down a bit through the 90s and early 2000s, but hovers close to 60% since 2008. Public interest in, quote, environmental pollution has gone down steadily since 1990, starting at about 63% down to about 46% in 2008 and close to 40% in 2016.
I wonder if that's largely this ozone layer-like effect. So that was a big deal, late 80s and 90s. There was the Montreal Protocol, which made progress to address the ozone. And then over time, the ozone layer is healing. Now, air pollution is not quite the same as ozone layer, and ozone and air pollution are not the same as climate change and that sort of thing. But I wonder if, kind of the average person's like, oh yeah, the ozone was a thing, and now I hear less about it because there's fewer CFCs in our products.
Yeah, and I think there's also like compartmentalization of like how people see certain problems. So if I talk to someone about environmental pollution, they'll be like, what are we talking about, smog? Well, I'm more concerned about climate change. Well, it's kind of all the same thing, but maybe people think about it differently. I don't know. But definitely like smog seems to be down, even though climate change is an increasingly severe problem. Right?
Well, that's a good point. It could be that air pollution is better, which I think it is in many places, and it's much worse in other places. But if it's better, then it actually tracks reality in a loose sense perceptually.
Oh, sure.
Like, there's fewer air pollution issues where I live, so therefore I'm less concerned about it.
Yeah, if we're strictly talking about like smog or like particulate in the air compared to like CO2 emissions, which are affecting the Earth's temperature. Interest in space exploration rises and dips quite a bit since 1981. So it goes between about 20 and 35%. Since 2008, it rises only slightly from 20% to 23%. In recent years, this topic is much more political since Elon Musk is now considered kind of a bad guy by the left. We'll see how that tracks going forward.
But it does popularize it. Like, the videos of the rockets taking off or landing impressively. It certainly makes people more aware how they feel about it.
Yeah.
It's also, for the average person, it might be fair to think, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
What's the purpose?
It's a common complaint.
Well, right. Like, people are suffering here, right? On home, and they need various things of what's in space. What's the point of that? Now, you could say, like, compared to what? The junk food and makeup and all the other stuff we buy with other monies. Sure. But that's, personal choice.
Yeah, we could be bombing countries with that money instead of sending people to space, right?
Why not do both, Adam?
So how about climate change? A graph of American belief that global warming is happening conveniently dates back to late 2008, which is when we started the show.
Oh, yeah.
For some reason, the first data point is a bit of an outlier, and there's like a bunch of questions, and they're all just an outlier in 2008, so I don't know if they asked different people or something. So it starts at 71%, dips down to 57% in 2010, and then gradually goes up to 72% in 2023. So again, this is the belief that global warming is happening. So belief in climate change being a reality. In general, with some fluctuation, this belief appears to be increasing over time. When those who say they don't know if global warming is happening are asked for their best guess, this remains somewhat consistent at around 80% saying it is happening since late 2017. So it's really ranging from 79% to 83%. So there's not much to say about this. It hasn't changed too much. So when we track the number of people who are extremely or very sure global warming is happening, this is also increasing. So again, we have a 51% outlier in 2008, it goes down to 33% in 2010, and slowly increases over time and peaks at 57% in 2021, is currently at 49%. And the last estimate is from 2023. Inversely, people who are extremely or very sure global warming is not happening have been somewhat consistent over time since 2008. This varies between 5 and 13%, and it's currently around 8%. So I would have guessed that as we're more polarized, both of these measures would increase, right? People who believe strongly that it is and that it isn't happening would go up as people get more polarized. Charitably, I would say that perhaps even those who are against climate change mitigation policies may still be accepting that it is occurring, but disagreeing on relative importance of acting upon it. So hopefully this data is really telling us it's hard to deny and people are just believing that climate change is real. Or maybe they think it's real, but they just don't think it's man-made. This view has also improved over time. We see a gradual increase over time of the number of Americans who think global warming is caused mostly by human activities. Again, an outlier of 57% in 2008, down to 46% in 2010, and gradually increasing into the low 60s. And it's 58% today. But the inverse, people who think global warming is caused mostly by natural changes in the environment, fluctuates slightly, but is somewhat consistent over time from 2008 to today. So, the information has helped people come to what I view as the right conclusion, and if there is any misinformation to tell them otherwise, it's not working. I think part of this is that as time goes by, the data continues to support the trend, so it's a bit harder to ignore, even if some scientists have been saying this for, over half a decade. It's worth mentioning that you can be a climate change advocate and have false beliefs. So there seems to be a somewhat popular belief that climate change will cause near human extinction in the next few years. For example, things like climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years, or where the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. So beliefs like this aren't supported by the evidence and do not reflect the conclusions of the majority of climate scientists. It's useful to be concerned and motivated to action, but I don't think it's useful to have exaggerated beliefs. We can disagree on that. Maybe you can argue otherwise, but that's how I feel. Ultimately, this damages the credibility of those making such statements, potentially harms the movement in general. People can be critical of that and trying to dig up sources that aren't there and things like that.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to be wrong or less correct.
Yeah.
And I think even most recent IPCC projections were, things could get bad and things could go pretty bad, but not truly catastrophic end of humanity bad within the next couple decades. Now there are, feedback cycles that are hard to account for, but most projections are, there's bad things that are happening now and suffering will occur, but not as dramatic as some people make it out to be.
Yeah, and sometimes people are kind of concerned about the worst things. They're, the sea level is going to change, and then all our houses are going to be flooded. And you kind of look at the data, and it's like, okay, maybe 3-5 centimeters. It's not going to flood my house, but there are other problems and other negative effects that could seriously affect human well-being and flourishing. So.
Or other places on
be realistic.
Or other places on Earth, right? Where the sea levels. Just as a behind the scenes for a moment, surveys sometimes are very difficult to design unless they make a lot of effort to ask the right question. And in this sense, I don't know what they did. I think most of these things are pretty legit and they spell out human-caused climate change and so on. But in sort of colloquial speech, global warming has come to mean something like human-caused climate change. And even climate change with like the capital C change, that is somewhat synonymous with human-caused climate change or warming. While if you say changing climate, well, someone might think, well, that's the same thing. Like, no, because the Earth's climate changes, as we know, over many, many years and many different cycles and natural cycles. So all I have to say is I'm sympathetic to an average person who says, what do you mean climate change is not a change in climate? Like, well, no, not technically to some people who study this stuff. And that can be very infuriating. And so, yes, there are natural cycles, but there is a bit of a hockey stick thing going on, which the best way to explain it is humans doing stuff.
Yeah. All right. So enough serious stuff. What about aliens?
I'm not saying it's aliens, but...
And aliens are serious. Just, most of the discourse about them is not really. Now, I can't say we would categorize this as a true or false belief. For argument's sake, let's say there is no reliable evidence that aliens are currently among us. Okay, I'm open-minded about aliens. I'm big on the idea, but that doesn't mean I think UFOs are aliens, right?
It's actually a good test subject because Adam wants to believe, but there's just not enough there.
Yeah. So, what's the measure here? In the U.S., we can compare numbers from 1996 to 2022 for the number of Americans who believe that UFO sightings, we call them UAPs now, are likely proof of aliens. In 1996, it was 20%. In 2022, it was 34%. So it went up a lot. Another comparison I saw between 1996 and 2021 had almost no change. So that was 49% changing to 50% of people agreeing with the question. Do you think the government is keeping information from the public that shows UFOs, unidentified flying objects, are real and that aliens have visited Earth? Now, evidently, these numbers are very high, right? Half of the population believing this. But this has been how it's phrased. Do I think that the government of the United States is keeping information about UFOs from its citizens? Yes. Do I think that that evidence, if it was uncovered, would prove that aliens exist and have been to the Earth? Probably not. So people may believe that without necessarily believing a false thing.
Again, the difficulty of asking certain questions is if you ask too many things within a question, you don't quite know what someone's answering.
Mm-hmm. So personally, while I have my eyes to the sky and love to look into UFO videos, I have not yet seen anything compelling enough to make me think that beings from another planet are the most plausible explanation for these.
And if any of our alien listeners are willing to write in and disprove this, just let us know.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully they're able to get onto our internet and they can write to info@trcpodcast.com.
That's a great email address.
The email address has not been a problem. Now let's look at some other then and now conspiracy theory beliefs. So answers to the question, do you think the US government has engaged in the assassination of entertainers who have tried to spread a countercultural message they didn't like, such as John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, Tupac Shakur, and others, or not? So this went up from 12% in 2013 to 20% in 2021.
A bit of a jump.
Yep. Not a huge number, though. Another question, do you believe that the pharmaceutical industry is in league with the medical industry to invent new diseases in order to make money or not? This has gone up a bit. It was 15% in 2013 and was 20% in 2021.
Yeah, even that, right? Because there's reasonable concerns about pharma, about institutionalized large bureaucratic structures in medicines, and people do types of gain-of-function research where they're literally kind of create new diseases to study them, but not necessarily putting all together for that purpose.
Yeah, so I believe there's a lot of problems with a lot of these things, but are people making diseases to sell cures? That specifically I don't believe is true. 9/11 conspiracies haven't changed much. Between 2011 and 2021, the belief that the U.S. government planned the September 11th attacks so that the U.S. could go to war in the Middle East stayed consistent at 19%. How silly. Since when does the U.S. government need a reason to go to war?
Oh, snipe. I remember shortly after 9/11, there was some survey done where 25% of Americans thought it was an inside job, and half thought Saddam Hussein was responsible.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, you're both probably wrong.
Differently wrong.
Yes. Well, that's concerning, right? Yeah. Differently wrong, but also wrong. Yeah. And you're like, oh boy. Now, one of those was largely due to tons of propaganda on one side. We'll just put it that way. And conflating different things. And of course, there's always this, the government's attacking its own citizens, which, the large government agencies have been deployed against their own citizens for numerous things. But anyway, I don't want to litigate whether 9/11 was an inside job, but it seems like it wasn't. I think we can clearly say that.
I would say that. Yeah. That's true, yeah. Finally, I looked at a study from the National Library of Medicine titled Have Beliefs in Conspiracy Theories Increased Over Time? So while the research showed that many people believe conspiracy theories and that there is a perception amongst scholars, journalists, and policymakers that conspiracy theory beliefs is increasing, I quote, "There's no hard evidence that conspiracy theories are circulating more widely today than ever before." So they ran 4 studies tracking conspiracism changes over periods from 7 months to 55 years, using tens of thousands of measures in 7 countries, and there was little evidence that it increased. While there is some increase in individual beliefs, there were more that decreased over time. While some suggest some new factor is to blame for the increase in conspiracy theory beliefs, since that increase isn't demonstrated, such explanations are not necessarily true. Those beliefs do not appear to have increased in the age of the internet or social media. I would therefore suggest that they have similarly not increased in the age of podcasting. The authors therefore suggest that the so-called echo chambers may not be as widespread as some believe, and that they are not so much converting people as they are reinforcing beliefs that people already hold. Alternatively, all those explanations for people believing false things are true. However, they are countered by the Reality Check podcast.
Nice solid turnaround at the end, Adam. That is interesting. That does run counter to a lot of people's intuitions.
Yeah.
I know the idea of echo chambers is a popular hypothesis. For people who, again, look into this stuff, you can find PhDs on both sides where someone says, of course this is a thing, look at this. And someone else like, of course it isn't a thing, look at this. And you're like, well, look, people are getting more entrenched, as you said, and yet they're being exposed to more ideas.
Yep.
Which then the opposite ideas sometimes make them more entrenched and sometimes make them more open-minded. It's just a lot of variability about how these things ripple through. But the prevalence of conspiracies is interesting to think about because it certainly seems like there's just more humans, a lot more than there used to be.
Yes.
And so there'd be more ideas around whether they're new or old, slipping in and out of fashion. I'm not saying I'm making a great point here. It's just the complexity of how to study this type of thing when you're having dramatic changes in demographics over time.
One illusory aspect may simply be I hear about conspiracy theories more thanks to the internet, even if I'm not any more inclined to believe in them. So I may think that they're more common just because I see them now.
I was thinking the same thing too. It's like availability, right? Yeah. The frequency is giving you a confusion of base rates and so on. Frequency of exposure is giving you a confusion of total base rates. I was thinking the same thing too, especially because we do this podcast. We're a bit more on the lookout or pay attention to, that thing may not be true. And I was thinking like, if I didn't do this at all, would I just notice or sort of quote unquote notice as many things that need to be addressed or seem to be false?
There's a lot of information out there, some good, some bad. Ultimately, it doesn't seem that all of this bad information has made people significantly wronger about many issues. Though there are some changes in individual ones. We can perhaps find this somewhat encouraging, depending on your attitude. My approach will remain the same. I'll try to put the truth as I understand it out there and hope that some people find it compelling and are at least interested in using their own judgment to try to discern the truth about other things in the world.
Hear, hear. Well, thanks, Adam. I think it's an important comparison to make. I think it's very difficult to make it. Like you can see someone like they do a PhD thesis on this type of thing. So I appreciate you doing what you can in the time we have. And it does seem, at least in some ways, things have gotten a bit better. There's room for hope, right? Mm-hmm. And as you also hinted at, the counterfactual, meaning if people didn't try, if they weren't promoting good critical thinking and reasonable ideas, it could be even worse.
Yep.
Sometimes we cognitively think like, okay, what I'm doing doesn't matter. Like, well, you don't know. The counterfactual, again, could be worse. Mm-hmm. And more broadly, a big thank you to all you listeners who tune in each and every week whenever we put a show out and who stayed with us over the years or tuning in recently for the first time. We definitely appreciate it. Maybe there'll be another 700 to come. As Adam and I get into our later ages and we're in the 2040s, we'll see. We definitely appreciate you checking us out.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking that it's been 16 years, that 700 episodes, obviously it's a huge number and it feels like that way too. And it feels like it was just yesterday, but obviously it also feels like it was a lifetime ago. And thank you to anyone who's stuck with us throughout all these years.
Yeah, it sure is wild, right? Because before times, what's a podcast, right? Mm-hmm. And now like, everyone has one. And like, misinformation's a problem. Like, yeah, we thought so 16 years ago. And one last thing before we head out, you may be aware that Darren McKee, I wrote a book called Uncontrollable, The Threat of Artificial Superintelligence and the Race to Save the World. And I just thought I'd mention it because people are still curious about what's going on with AI, why are people concerned about the risks, and what can we do about it? I address all those in a very beginner-friendly, engaging way. And in case you're sympathetic to the argument from authority, Max Tegmark said Uncontrollable is a captivating, balanced, and remarkably up-to-date book on the most important issue of our time. And I think it would make a great holiday gift for those in your family who are curious about the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd give it to my family, but most of them have already got a copy that I gave them last year.
Adam, you're so sweet. Thanks once again, listeners. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.
Outtakes. There's a time and a place, Adam.
I know. I won't even put in the outtakes. It's all right.
That's good. So fast forwarding a bit. Fast forwarding, that is even an old term. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Double click the advanced 15-second button on my podcast listening app.
Scrub forward. We'll cut all that. Okay.
There was a joke I made last time, but it kind of fell flat, so I don't remember what it was.
Fell flat to me? That's a good outtake. Your audience is so funny. To you, your own joke fell flat to you. Sure. But that's personal choice.
Yeah, we could be bombing countries with that money instead of sending people to space, right?
Why not do both, Adam? You mean you bomb with people? People bombs? What are you talking about?
It might come off as insensitive, but I don't know.
I think you can keep all of it.
Okay.
Because I think it's meant to be satirical, and then mine is even more.
Yes.
Well, someone going to write in now? Yeah. I've been a loyal fan for 700 episodes.
We are being critical of bombing people. Yes. Like yes.
You don't have to qualify that.
Yes. No. I didn't mean that. That wasn't for the audience. That was I was just saying that I think that was clearly.
In the transcript, it said, "Why not bomb people?" No, but I didn't say it. Do you know the Bill Burr thing?
Yeah.
You get a bad read.
And as I sit here and we record episode 700, I think back, and it feels like it was only a couple weeks ago that we were around this same table recording episode 700. So things have really changed.
Things have really changed, yeah. It was many moons ago.
Sorry, that was like a joke about our scrap recording that probably won't make sense.
That's true. You're right. You know what? It won't. So maybe you should say. I didn't even get it. I'm like, I guess we started at Carleton, but all right.
No. Maybe I should say
something more true.
Yeah.